Abraham Lincoln born? Well, the history books we all read in school tell us Kentucky. A lot of people, including some historians, though, question whether that is true.
The lab was silent. Only the soft hum of machines and the occasional click of a keyboard broke the stillness. Scientists leaned over microscopes, staring at digital screens that glowed like ghosts in the dim room.
Did President Lincoln have African ancestry? There were some rumors that President Lincoln specifically didn't talk a lot about his mother, Nancy Hanks.
A vial sat on a metal tray, unassuming, almost fragile, containing the remnants of a life that had ended more than 2 centuries ago. This vial held a piece of history. It held the DNA of Nancy Hanks Lincoln, mother of Abraham Lincoln, the woman whose name most remember in passing, whose life has always been overshadowed by the towering figure of her son. But now, in the sterile light of the lab, her secrets were beginning to speak. For decades, historians have debated Nancy Hanks's origins. Born in the 1780s on the Virginia frontier, she was the daughter of mystery. Her parentage had been lost in the fog of time, whispered rumors, and incomplete records. Some claimed she was of English descent. Others suggested German roots. Every theory had holes, contradictions that historians could never fully reconcile. But DNA doesn't lie, or at least it tells a story that no one can easily dismiss. When the first sample was carefully extracted, researchers held their breath. The technology had advanced enough to sequence fragments that would have been considered useless just a decade ago. Each gene, each marker, was a thread in a tapestry that historians had been trying to weave for centuries. The screen flickered as the data loaded. One by one, the sequences appeared, a digital echo of Nancy Hanks's genetic heritage. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The markers suggested the presence of typical European ancestry. But as the analysis deepened, a pattern emerged that no one expected. Connections appeared to obscure frontier families, groups that had migrated from the edge of Virginia into the untamed lands of Kentucky. Families whose histories were barely recorded, who had moved often, who had fought, starved, and survived in ways that official documents never captured. And within those markers were hints of lineages that seemed anomalous, not in a sinister way, but in a way that reshaped the story of early American settlement. Nancy Hanks had not been born into the prominent, well-documented families that populated Virginia records. She had been part of a hidden network, a web of families that had crossed the mountains, clinging to life in log cabins and rough clearings, leaving almost no trace behind. DNA now made those invisible threads visible. It told of hardship. It told of survival against impossible odds. But it also told of connections that had been deliberately erased or ignored in historical records. Families who had married quietly, migrated quietly, whose descendants would one day include the greatest president America had ever known. The more the scientists analyzed, the stranger the story became. Some of the genetic markers suggested distant ancestry from places historians had not considered. There were hints of migration routes that connected the American frontier not just to England or Germany, but to regions of Britain less known for colonization, to families who had moved through the back roads of Europe before arriving in Virginia. The revelation was staggering. Every fragment of DNA told a story of movement, of risk, of human courage, and every story carried echoes of tragedy. Nancy Hanks's life had been brief. She had died when Abraham was just 9 years old, leaving him and his father to navigate the harsh world of frontier life. Her death was recorded simply as illness, fever, hardship. But now, in this lab, researchers realized that her genetic inheritance carried the resilience and the vulnerabilities of generations who had lived on the margins. The ramifications were immediate. Historians had always wondered whether Nancy's mysterious background had influenced Lincoln. He had been sensitive, introspective, drawn to the written word and to questions of justice and morality. DNA could not explain his genius, but it could reveal the invisible scaffold of lineage that shaped his early life. Every test result was cross-checked. Multiple labs confirmed the patterns. The markers were real. They told of families that had survived smallpox outbreaks, harsh winters, and frontier violence. They told of intermarriage among distant kin, of isolation that forced families to rely on each other in extraordinary ways. These were the ancestors who shaped Nancy Hanks, who shaped Abraham Lincoln. But there were darker notes as well. Some markers suggested exposure to genetic lines that were prone to certain illnesses. Historians had speculated about the harsh environment of the frontier affecting the Lincolns' health. But the DNA hinted at inherited vulnerabilities that had compounded the challenges they faced. Nancy Hanks had not just lived in a harsh world. She had carried a legacy of fragility alongside resilience. The story unfolded like a thriller. Each new connection revealed a layer of social history erased from official records. There were names of families that no longer appeared in census data, lineages that vanished without explanation. DNA had resurrected them. It had traced paths across counties, states, and borders that paper records ignored. And then came the discovery that truly shocked the researchers. Certain markers suggested connections to families in which slavery, servitude, and frontier violence had left genetic imprints. This was not to demonize Nancy Hanks or her descendants. It was to reveal that the frontier was not a simple story of pioneers and clean morality. It was a brutal, complex place, and the DNA told the story more honestly than any written account could. Every revelation raised questions. How did these distant, almost forgotten lineages converge to produce Nancy Hanks? How did she, born into obscurity, become the mother of a man who would change the world? DNA was giving history a voice, a way to tell stories that had been silenced for centuries. Researchers began mapping the networks. They created a digital family tree that sprawled across the map of early America. Each connection was a path through hardship and survival. There were families who had fought in the Revolutionary War, who had fled westward to escape poverty and disease, who had married in secret, who had struggled to hold on to life in log cabins with dirt floors and no formal documentation. Nancy Hanks emerged from the data not as a footnote, but as a central figure in a human story of survival. The shocking part was not evil or sinister. It was the raw truth, that the foundations of Abraham Lincoln's life were built on resilience, struggle, and the hidden complexity of frontier America. As the scientists continued, more surprises emerged. Some DNA markers suggested kinship with families whose stories had never been told in books. Families whose histories had been erased by war, disease, and neglect. These were not the grand figures of history. They were ordinary people who had faced extraordinary circumstances. And from their quiet lives, Nancy Hanks inherited the strands of resilience that would echo through her son. Historians watching the analysis were stunned. Every genealogical chart had to be revised. Every assumption about her ancestry was challenged. The image of Nancy Hanks as a simple, enigmatic woman became more intricate, more human. She was at once fragile and formidable, shaped by generations who had survived what many would consider impossible. The revelations even affected how Lincoln scholars viewed the president himself. His empathy, his moral clarity, his understanding of struggle, could it have roots in the obscure, resilient lineage of his mother? DNA could not answer that question definitively, but it added a layer of depth, a tangible link between the frontier hardships Nancy endured and the man who would later navigate a nation through its most brutal internal conflict. Families descended from the same obscure Hanks lines were contacted. Some had been unaware of their connection to Nancy Hanks. Others had oral histories passed down, half forgotten, now confirmed in the digital age. Stories of hardship, courage, and survival were validated by the science that reached across centuries. The lab became a shrine to the past. Every sequence, every marker, was a reminder that history is more than what is written in books. It is in our bodies, in our genes, in the invisible connections that tie us to lives long gone. Nancy Hanks's DNA told a story of the frontier, of the human capacity to endure, of the hidden complexity behind a mother who has always been seen as a footnote. As the final analyses were completed, the scientists gathered around the computer. They looked at the digital tapestry of ancestry laid bare before them. Each line, each connection, a thread that tied the past to the present. And for the first time, they realized they were not just studying DNA, they were studying the very fabric of human survival. The story of Nancy Hanks Lincoln was no longer mysterious. It was raw, intricate, and profoundly human. DNA had revealed not horror, not scandal, but the truth of human endurance, a truth that framed her life, and by extension, the life of Abraham Lincoln, in a new and deeply resonant light. It was a story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, of women and men who labored, suffered, loved, and survived in the harshest conditions. And in Nancy Hanks, those threads converged into a life that would indirectly shape the destiny of a nation. In the end, the DNA did not just answer questions about ancestry. It posed new questions about history itself, about whose stories are told, whose are forgotten, and how the invisible strands of human life carry forward through generations. Abraham Lincoln's mother had died young, known only through letters, memories, and a few official records. But now, she had a voice that could not be ignored. A voice told through genes, through markers, through the quiet persistence of life itself. The researchers saved every file, printed every chart, and documented every lineage. This was a discovery that would redefine historical understanding, not because it revealed shocking wrongdoing, but because it revealed the profound resilience of ordinary humans whose lives built the foundation of extraordinary history. And somewhere, in the digital threads of DNA, Nancy Hanks whispered across the centuries, telling her story at last. The frontier she had known, the hardships she endured, the people who shaped her, all of it alive in the sequences, a hidden legacy finally brought to light. History, the lab realized, had always been alive. It had just taken science to give it a voice loud enough for the world to hear. The lab lights dimmed as evening settled outside, but inside, the glow of monitors and the quiet hum of sequencers kept time with the story that was unfolding. Every DNA strand was a whisper from the past, carrying with it the echoes of a woman whose life had been brief, but whose legacy had been long, woven into the very fabric of a nation. Researchers pored over genealogical charts, mapping not just names but lives. One marker led to a family that had migrated through the Shenandoah Valley, fleeing harsh winters and economic collapse. Another traced a line through the Ohio frontier, where smallpox and isolation had claimed many lives before any record could capture their struggles. Each genetic clue added texture to the story of Nancy Hanks, illuminating the harsh reality of frontier survival. And with each discovery, the narrative grew more vivid. Nancy's maternal line suggested women who were resourceful and resilient, who raised children while fending off disease and hunger, who maintained communities in the absence of formal structures. These were women whose names were lost to history, but whose genes spoke louder than any document ever could. The scientists paused at a particularly striking discovery. Some markers indicated kinship with families that had lived on the peripheries of colonial society, settlers, craftsmen, and laborers whose contributions had never been recorded in official annals. This wasn't scandal, it was revelation. It was understanding the hidden architecture of society that shaped the environment in which Abraham Lincoln's mother grew up. Through this lens, Nancy Hanks's life was no longer mysterious. She was a product of hardship, yes, but also of resilience, courage, and hidden networks of kinship. Her lineage told of survival against the odds, of humans navigating the edge of civilization with ingenuity and determination. Every tiny fragment of DNA was a testament to her strength. Historians watching this research began to rethink previously held assumptions. They had long considered Nancy Hanks's life an enigma, a background for the story of her son. But these revelations suggested that the foundations of Lincoln's character might be traced back to generations of women and men who had endured, who had cultivated moral resilience as a necessary tool for survival on the frontier. Even subtle markers told a story. Genetic traces suggested communities that had formed around mutual aid, knowledge of herbal remedies, skills in survival, and ways of life attuned to the harsh rhythms of frontier life. Nancy inherited these traits biologically, but also culturally, in an environment that required ingenuity, patience, and persistence. The DNA also hinted at vulnerabilities. Certain lineages carried inherited susceptibilities to disease and early death. These markers helped explain the brevity of Nancy Hanks's life, offering a medical lens to a historical mystery. The frontier was brutal, and genetics amplified the risks she faced, even as her resilience allowed her to raise children who would leave indelible marks on history. Beyond health, there were traces of geographic migration that reshaped historical maps. Lines connected Virginia to the western frontier, tracing routes through counties previously ignored by historians. Every migration told a story of human courage, of families pushing the boundaries of survival into unknown territory, of sacrifices made in the hope of a better life. The researchers began connecting the past to the present. Descendants of the same lines were discovered across multiple states, some unaware of their connection to the Hanks lineage. Oral histories that had been preserved by families were suddenly confirmed. These were the invisible threads that had carried culture, resilience, and survival strategies across generations. And then came the revelation that tied the entire study together. Nancy Hanks's genetic profile was not exceptional in isolation, but it was remarkable in context. Her ancestry reflected a tapestry of human experience, ordinary people meeting extraordinary challenges, surviving, adapting, and leaving traces that would echo in her son, who would shape the nation's destiny. As the night deepened, the lab was alive with reflection. The scientists weren't just decoding genes, they were decoding history itself. The story of frontier survival, of resilience, of hidden family networks was now illuminated in vivid detail. DNA had provided a lens into the past that historical documents alone could never achieve. Nancy Hanks's story became a mirror of early America. Each genetic trace revealed the complexity of migration, survival, and adaptation. It revealed the often overlooked influence of ordinary people whose contributions had been invisible for centuries. Through her, the past spoke not in dry records, but in living, breathing sequences of life. The lab team presented their findings at a historical conference. Scholars were captivated by the revelations, the combination of science and history offering a depth of understanding previously impossible. Every chart, every DNA sequence, every reconstructed lineage told a story of humanity, struggle, and enduring legacy. And as they concluded, a quiet truth emerged. History is not only written by kings, generals, and presidents. History is also written in the lives of ordinary people, whose struggles and resilience are carried forward invisibly in their descendants. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, mother of Abraham Lincoln, was one of those people. Her life, once mysterious and ephemeral, had been resurrected through science. She was no longer a footnote. She was a central figure in the story of human endurance, a symbol of how genetics can reveal hidden histories, and a reminder of the extraordinary lives that lie behind every ordinary name in the annals of time. The lab closed for the night, but the work was far from done. Each discovery led to new questions, new avenues of research. What other forgotten lineages shaped the world in unseen ways? How many stories of resilience were hidden in the DNA of people whose names had been lost to history? And somewhere, across the centuries, Nancy Hanks's life continued to speak. Her genes told of survival, of courage, of the complexity of frontier life. They told of ordinary people living extraordinary lives. And in that story, Abraham Lincoln's legacy found its roots, not just in his own achievements, but in the quiet resilience of his mother and the generations before her. The revelation was profound. Understanding history requires more than documents and letters. It requires listening to the past encoded in our very cells. And when science and history converge, the truth emerges in a way that is simultaneously shocking, humbling, and deeply human. In the quiet of the lab, the scientists reflected on the journey they had undertaken. They had not only uncovered the ancestry of a mother long gone, but they had glimpsed the hidden scaffolding of a nation built on resilience, courage, and the often unseen struggles of ordinary people. As dawn approached, the final sequences were catalogued. Every marker, every connection, every discovery was preserved for future generations. The story of Nancy Hanks Lincoln was no longer hidden. It was a story that would endure, a reminder that history lives not only in books, but in the silent, enduring language of DNA. And in that revelation lay the ultimate lesson. The past is never truly gone. It flows within us, shapes us, and connects us to those who came before. The life of Nancy Hanks, once a mystery, had become a testament to human endurance, and through her, the story of Abraham Lincoln gained a deeper, more resonant dimension. The lab emptied, the hum of machines fading into silence. Outside, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, illuminating the fields that had once been frontier land. And somewhere in the quiet, across the centuries, the whispers of history continued, carried in the genes of a mother and in the legacy of her son, who would forever be remembered as the great emancipator. The story was far from over. Science had opened a door, and the world could now step through it into a history richer, more intricate, and more human than anyone had imagined. Nancy Hanks Lincoln had spoken, and for the first time the world was listening. Her resilience, her lineage, her hidden struggles, all were laid bare. And through them, a new understanding of history had emerged, a history written not just in words, but in life itself. It was shocking, not in horror, but in truth, not in scandal, but in revelation. The past had found its voice, and through Nancy Hanks Lincoln, it had found its way into the heart of the present, echoing across time in a story of endurance, survival, and the quiet, extraordinary power of ordinary lives.